And so that's sort of how things got a bit altered. And then at the same time, in the 1950s and 60s, the discovery of modern ventilators caused another major ethical dilemma with how we define death. And if Lindsey, if you're comfortable, I'm happy to sort of hand over to talk about, you know, the advent of the idea that you could be declared dead based upon neurological or brain-based criteria.
Yeah, so thanks, Sam, for that great introduction and sort of kind of initial tackling of this very difficult question. I think, yeah, as a neurologist, you know, something that we think about a lot is, you know, this question of sort of, we've always kind of known about, you know, sort of cardiac death, and when someone's heart has stopped beating, they're no longer alive. But then I think in the 70s, and I don't want to say I have a colleague, Ariane Lewis, who does a lot of work in this area, brain death, and you know, could speak kind of in more detail about this. But I think that around the 1970s, we started to have this understanding of you could still have your heart beating and sort of still be, you know, supported by a ventilator and being sort of circulating blood and oxygen, but have had an injury to your brain that is so catastrophic that makes it impossible that you would recover function after that. And so there kind of emerged this idea of death by neurologic criteria, or what's called brain death. And the way that we evaluate that is sort of, we look at the very basic kind of reflex functions of how the brain works. And if we cannot find any evidence of that, we say, you know, and we sort of take the entire context and think about, is there any sort of other issue going on that could be reversible? And you know, sort of come to the conclusion that the brain function in this person is not going to be restored through any means. And so this is sort of an interesting cultural idea, this idea that you could, if you have your heart beating, but if your brain is not working, you are still technically sort of legally considered to be dead. There's a lot of sort of controversy about this at times. But yeah, I think that is sort of the one of the kind of main criteria now that we diagnose death with.
I don't know if the others have anything else they want to add. I'd like to add another nuance to that, though, if there are others. I think, you know, what's fascinating, though, is, and it's important to point out, you know, some people think that, sort of to Dr. Gurin's point, you know, that actually now doctors don't think you're dead if your heart has stopped. You're only dead if you have brain death. And I think I just want to explain this a little bit more, which is that, you know, 98% of people, think of all the people who had COVID, people who had car accidents, people who have, you know, major infections and heart attacks and so on and so forth, they all are declared dead because their heart stops and doctors can't revive them anymore. Small proportion we can bring back, but most of them can't be, and therefore they're permanently dead. And there's about 2% of the population who have catastrophic brain injuries. And because they're on a ventilator and we can artificially keep their hearts and lungs moving and beating, that their brain may die before the heart stops. And so legally we can declare them dead instead of waiting, because obviously we understand, you know, the seat of the soul, the seat of consciousness is the brain. If you have no brain left, then what's the point? Even if artificially in the ICU, I can keep blood flowing around your body. But what's also very interesting, which I think is the newer discovery with respect to death, is that actually the first phase after we die, because doctors, we were all taught that after you've been deprived of oxygen for about 5 minutes, the brain is permanently and irreversibly damaged and it can never come back. And what we're now understanding that it's not quite as simple as that, but actually after we die and we turn into a cadaver, the cells inside the body include the brain, while they're not working, but that they don't disintegrate or die rapidly. And that actually it takes many hours for cells to become permanently damaged in a cadaver if you leave them alone. But ironically, when doctors like us, we go and try to revive the person and restart the heart, and we pump oxygen and the heart comes back, ironically, the oxygen that we have introduced becomes toxic and it causes the cells to die very quickly. So what this is making us understand is that actually when we become a cadaver, there is the potential to come back. And so actually the early phase of death remains potentially reversible, and the inability to come back to life reflects the lack of medical knowledge or technology or lack of discoveries, you know, things that might be in the future. And that's a very important point to understand, because what it means is we can actually explore what happens not just leading up to death, but after death. And some of those people we can bring back to life again. And that's what's fascinating about this. This is like a more 21st century understanding of death.
So I don't know if any of the other panelists had anything to add to that. You guys can.
I could jump in, but I'm gonna change channels a bit. So it's great to be here and see you all. So I'm not a physician. I don't work with physical death and the remarkable work that others do here. But I've been fortunate for about 15 years to be working with psychedelic compound psilocybin that generates profoundly altered states of consciousness, non-ordinary states. That there's been a fair amount written on this. That the phenomenology of those states of awareness seem to dovetail in some way, some of the values with near-death experiences. And just to frame this, and I can come back to this, our trials are not set up to explore people's experience of whatever death might be in consciousness. It was about treating people in palliative care or psycho-oncology, people with advanced cancer who had serious anxiety or depression, with one dose of psilocybin, this compound that's found in mushrooms. We published our papers in 2016 with Johns Hopkins, and we found that one experience, we call a peak or mystical experience, I can define that in a few moments, resulted in a dramatic and sustained reduction of depression, anxiety, hopelessness, demoralization, and improved spiritual and existential well-being, and a host of psychosocial benefits. But the other piece of that's the clinical piece and the findings, which are remarkable, and we're building upon that. And hopefully, psilocybin will be clinically available. These are still in clinical trials in maybe 5 years or so for those at the end of life. But one of the consequences of that was hearing these incredible narratives of people in our trials who, in this 3 or 4 hour, very altered state, will talk about that death, their insight, their experience was that death, there is no death. That while the body may die, whatever is consciousness, and we don't know, continues in some way. And that's been a fascinating aspect of the research. And it kind of comes back or comes to the hard problem that is consciousness generated by this remarkable and beautiful brain function we all have, or is it somehow more remarkable than that and somehow outside biology or more complicated than we think? And these patients say they enter that kind of experience. And quickly, before I pass it on, and I'll come back to all this a bit, the criteria for the mystical or peak experience found in the trials being done in the research, one is a sense of unity, the subjective sense that these participants have of all things being interconnected, all people and things. The noetic quality, a coined term by William James, that they're encountering ultimate reality. People rarely come back from this experience and say, I had a temporary drug effect. It speaks with such authority where they say that was reality, or that was more real than this. A sense of sacredness. And importantly, I feel a very important feature is the subjective sense of transcendence, transcending time and place as we know it, transcending their body. And for someone who is dying and his body is beginning to fail, the insight or the experience that there's something more enduring about consciousness is a profound gift. And it's those narratives they tell us that are just really remarkable. And while the near-death experience or recalled experience of death is in many ways different from these experiences in terms of some of the specifics of it, the values seems to be a common ground of values, and that is of predominantly one of love. That and Kenneth Ring speaks about this often, who did near-death experience research, that the primacy feeling is one of love, love towards self, towards others, and more importantly, this, or more dramatically, that all of being or all of this landscape of consciousness is one of love. So it's remarkable research, and these narratives do dovetail with some of this language about what might happen post death. And I'll pass it on and come back to that more later. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for bringing that up. Dr. Parnia and Dr. Gurin, you guys did a really good job of explaining medically what death is and how that has changed and how that is beginning to really change how clinicians and nurses may actually treat people who've had cardiac arrest. Like you guys mentioned, you were probably taught in medical school that the brain died after 5 minutes or so, but we're learning that the process of cell death, neural activity can persist for hours after the heart has stopped. Especially when you think of situations and people who are hypothermic, their chances of being resuscitated can actually extend beyond this short time frame that traditionally people thought of. And Tony, when you were talking about this idea that death and life are not so black and white, really lends itself to how the medical definition of death is changing. And I think that when you brought up the recalled experiences of death, which Dr. Parnia, that's kind of been something that you have been researching for a long time. So maybe it would be good to kind of talk about now what these different types of experiences are that people have after crossing the biological threshold of death, meaning that their heart has stopped and blood circulation has stopped. Maybe it's something that you can begin to bring up.
I think that Tony, so first of all, for the audience, we all participated in creating a documentary during the height of COVID. And so everyone has different contributions around this subject. And so it's fantastic that we're all together. But Tony, just I think you're an odd patient man. You jumped to the sort of chase of the story. But I think we can definitely come back more to what Tony was raising with consciousness, because Megan is obviously a philosopher and Donald Hoffman is an expert on consciousness. And so there's a lot to talk about that, because this is Brain Awareness Week and we want to put it into context. And Lindsey Gurin is a neurologist. But in essence, I think what we understand now, which I was pointing out, is that, and I'd love to hear Lindsey's point of view on this too, but I know that it's important as a society and as scientists and doctors that we appreciate that biologically and medically speaking, we can go beyond the boundaries of death and people can come back. And there are many medical means that we can do it, and I don't think this is an ideal forum, but for example, there's basic CPR, then there are machines that have been devised that can do much higher quality chest compressions than what humans can do. Then there is a circuit called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. It's like heart-lung bypass. You can connect people through catheters in the neck and the groin when their hearts have stopped. And then you can artificially pump oxygenated blood around their body. You can cool them down like a refrigerator, how you do, and you can preserve cells for periods of time and go back and fix the underlying problem. There's a group who are doing this incredible research called emergency preservation resuscitation, where what they're doing is actually cooling about 16, 17 degrees Celsius, which is something in the 60s Fahrenheit, which is incredibly cold, and preserving them after they've died from like car accidents in the community, and then trying to get more, actually taking blood out of them, and then trying to preserve them, take them to the operating room, fix the problems, and then get them back to life again, which is incredible. Just to say that we're beyond the boundaries of death and exploring that. And then one of the things which is great for us to talk about, as you bring up, is that during the state when people have gone beyond the threshold of death, and sometimes people may have gone for tens of minutes, sometimes hours of time, it's very consistent that people have for decades been reporting that they have this very lucid, transcendent experience. Their consciousness, paradoxically to what we would understand, they look like they're unconscious from our perspective, but internally they're having a full lucid conscious experience. And they're able to describe this very profound event that occurs for them where, and we can discuss more, but they recognize that they've died. They see doctors and nurses reviving them. They feel they're watching everything from above. And they feel that although people are worried about them, they feel fine. And they say, actually, I feel more lucid, more conscious than I ever did before. They say that my consciousness has become vast. Suddenly they have access to information that they never had before. And that includes a memory of their entire lives, everything that they have done, everything, all their actions, all their thoughts, all their intentions towards other people. And it's not like the way the films project it, like your life flashing past your eyes. It's more of a very deep, insightful reevaluation and reappraisal of everything that you've done. So it's almost like everything's stored in their consciousness. And then in death, they're somehow accessing this and they're evaluating it, and then they recognize that their actions and intentions had meaning. And if they've done things that were wrong, they evaluate themselves. And if they have done things that were good, they also evaluate that. And they often see the downstream effects of those things. And furthermore, they experience those things from the perspective of other people that they've interacted with. And this is absolutely inexplicable to us scientifically. I think Lindsey would probably agree with me and Donald Hoffman is a cognitive neuroscientist. But it's absolutely astonishing to think that in death, where your brain circuits are shutting down, your brain is shutting down, that somehow consciousness is becoming more lucid, more vast, and there's this incredible experience going on. And then clearly at some point, there's a decision made where they feel they have to come back, and then they may come back, and now they're back in the same pain or discomfort that they would have had. And so I'm going to open this up to my esteemed colleagues who are here on this panel, who are all have a different perspective on this, because we're looking at consciousness, you know, a unique facet of consciousness in relation to death. But that's what there is. So I don't know if Lindsey or Donald or Megan or Tony, if you guys want to just jump in and tell us what your thoughts are.
I can jump in. I want to let you guys have time as well. I think just to your point, Sam, you know, I think just about this experience of sort of the vastness of consciousness and sort of being able to transcend the physical body. I think, you know, one thing I was thinking about also while Tony was speaking, and not to jump ahead, but this experience with psychedelics that where people describe what's called ego death, and you know, this sort of similar experience that people can have with a lot of sort of practice and experience meditating. This idea that the ego, or the sort of sense of self as a individual moving through space, sort of dictating your movements and kind of organizing your own thinking, and you know, this idea of ourselves as kind of a individual is really something our brain creates in order for us to sort of survive and move in the world. But that, you know, in reality, we are sort of a part of this larger experience, and that there are these sort of experiences you can have kind of at the edge of you know, sort of awareness, either with psychedelics or with you know, sort of at the edge of death, or with kind of, you know, very intensive meditation that can sort of lift away the filter that creates these ego boundaries, and sort of give you the experience of being connected with everything. I'm curious what you guys think about that.
I feel like that may be a kind of opening to some of the philosophical kind of thinking about death, because, you know, I think historically, philosophically, and this kind of dovetails with literature as well, but there's always been a lot of very different ideas and ambiguity and anxiety around the whole conception of death. And one of the things that I've been interested in is, you know, I think in the 20th century, we have sort of Heidegger standing as one of the primary thinkers of death philosophically in the 20th century. And that gives us a picture of a very kind of individualized relationship to death, where, you know, in essence, by facing up to the fact that I will die, that this is certain, but it's also uncertain because I don't know when or how, that I then have the opportunity to live authentically, to kind of change the way I go about leading my life. And I think that's been a very, you know, obviously powerful, motivating, and hugely influential philosophical theory of death in the 20th century. But the figure I work on more is Emmanuel Levinas, who is a Jewish philosopher whose thinking emanates in large degree out of a lived experience of the Second World War and the Holocaust, which really contests that highly individualized sensibility about death, and instead thinks about death as a relationship to the other person who is dying. And so it raises all kinds of questions, I think, for us in our own age about how it, you know, how close can we be to death and dying? What are the mechanisms in our medical system that distance us or that make it hard or impossible to be present or near with those who are dying? But Levinas's thinking, I think, is one way of kind of changing some of the dominant paradigms maybe, and helping us think about interrelationality, about the ways that we are connected to each other in different processes of dying, the fact that dying often takes time and is ambiguous even in its in how it's being experienced for those who are dying and those who are close with those who are dying. And because we're talking about ambiguity on this panel, you know, I think that part of what emanates out of this post-World War II reflection on death and dying is the sense that, you know, we may like to think about death as final, ultimate, the end, but that for many people, there is a lot of ambiguity around the experience of death and dying. And, you know, whether it's in the experiences of things like mourning and grief and trauma, the experience of feeling haunted, the survivors' experiences, that these are important, you know, facets to the conversation. So I think, you know, that's just a way of thinking about a kind of philosophical historical shift from a very kind of heroic individualized conception of death as my own to a more ambiguous communal conception of dying as something that's happening in very, you know, complex, ambiguous, and ongoing ways.
And I would contribute from the science side and, you know, cognitive neuroscience side that for the last several centuries, science has had two big assumptions: an ontology in which space-time is fundamental, and a methodology of reductionism, methodological reductionism, in which as you go to smaller scales in space-time, you get to deeper and more fundamental laws. And that ontology and that methodology has been spectacularly successful for centuries. But recently, and by the way, if you adopt that ontology and that methodology, then consciousness is at best an artifact or a creation of brain activity. And so when you die, these experiences that are reported are not an insight into some deeper realm. They're just the brain being addled as it dies, right? That would be the clear implication from that framework. But what's interesting is that in the last couple decades, physicists have been concluding that space-time is doomed, that space-time is not fundamental. And with it, reductionism, that reductionism, methodological reductionism, going to smaller scales to find deeper laws, has a limit. And in fact, a very clear limit. You can't go to smaller than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. And then things start getting, you know, as you add more energy to probe smaller scales, you just start dealing with larger scales, not smaller scales. So gravity, it turns out that gravity has messed things up. Space-time is doomed and reductionism is doomed because of properties of gravity. And so now science is, you know, scientists, good physicists are looking for what's beyond space-time. So this is not just space-time is doomed, oh well, throw up our hands and give up. It's rather, oh boy, space-time is doomed, how neat. What is behind space-time? What are the deep mathematical structures behind space-time? And what do they mean? So this opens a door, right? If space-time isn't fundamental, then what is? What is beyond space-time? And scientists are free to create mathematical models in which consciousness is fundamental. So we could imagine an ontology in which consciousness itself is fundamental and have a mathematical model of consciousness and a model of its dynamics, and then show mathematically precisely how that projects into what we call space-time, so that we could make predictions that we can measure inside space-time. Within that framework, then, it doesn't necessarily follow that the experiences that are reported in near-death experiences are insights. I mean, but at least it allows them. It allows that they could be insights. They could also just be mess-ups, you know, of some kind. But whereas in the physicalist framework, they are absolutely mess-ups. They are not insights. So this other framework in which consciousness is fundamental, it has to be worked out. We have to get mathematically precise models and show how space-time arises. But within that framework, we could then address the question technically, can we take these experiences as deep insights into a realm of consciousness beyond space-time? And if we pursue that, we'll have to answer deep questions like, what is consciousness doing and why? Why does consciousness choose to present itself as a human body in space and time for 70 or 80 or 90 years, or as an amoeba or as a virus? Why does consciousness choose to do that? So what is consciousness up to? So there are all sorts of questions that have to be answered for a scientist to take any of this seriously, right? We would have to answer these kinds of questions, but at least it opens the door that these near-death experiences could be genuine insights, but a lot of work has to be done to make that a serious science.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman, for bringing that up. So a lot was just said. I think that maybe it's safe to say that everyone here can probably agree that consciousness and the idea of the self is not stemming purely from physical matter. But I guess that kind of also brings up the question that science has advanced to the point where we're able to measure and study all of these different patterns of brain activity through MRIs and EEGs. So what is the relationship between this neural activity and our conscious experiences?
I can talk a little bit about that. I think, and I'll say this with a preface that in medicine, as Sam sort of referenced, and particularly neurologists, we have this idea that we can explain everything with the brain and that we sort of have these scientific explanations for all the things that happen. But I think sort of from the concrete scientific side, one, sort of the way that, there are many ways to think about this, but one sort of way of conceptualizing this has been something that was primarily popularized by Antonio Damasio, who's written a lot about emotions and cognition. And this idea that there is a fundamental sort of core emotional experience that we're having with consciousness. And this correlates actually. So the deepest part of the brain, the oldest part of the brainstem, contains nuclei that make neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. This is how our brain cells communicate with each other. And these core, very old sort of nuclei produce these emotional experiences that then, an idea is that the higher levels of brain function sort of elaborate on to create stories and explain to us who we are and to help us, make us feel that we're making decisions with free will and all these things, but that the sort of core experience of all this is what's affect or emotion. That, sort of, well, I think talk about this in a little bit, but that, in the patients who I see who have had sort of higher level brain injuries, but have preserved brainstem function, or sort of maybe somewhat more than that, you can have these disorders where you have kind of partial consciousness or a disorder of consciousness where you are having some experiences we believe, but maybe not sort of the full consciousness experience that we think of. But at the core, there is this sort of experience of being someone or being sort of in existence and having an emotional state, and that may be driving some of our experience into the group.
I would just add that from, again, looking at the physicalist assumptions versus some other non-physicalist assumption. If you're a physicalist, then you have to give the kind of explanation that Damasio is giving, in which the neural activity is in some sense causal, and it causes the conscious experiences to arise. But if space-time is doomed, and therefore the contents of space-time, including neurons, are not fundamental, then we're open to a completely different kind of interpretation. We would then interpret all the neural data that we have as not causal, but as correlational. So these are the neural correlates of conscious, which is perfectly fine, but maybe not the neural causes of consciousness, and maybe causality goes the other way. if consciousness is fundamental, then it is sui generis. It doesn't depend on anything in space and time for its existence, but it projects itself into space and time and gives us little images of itself that we call brains and neurons. And so those are the data that we've got. So we have to use, absolutely. I mean, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I love that data. I study that data. I'm not in no way denigrating the data. I'm just saying we may have to reinterpret it differently from the way I was trained, which was to view the neural activity as causal. If the neural activity is causal and space-time is fundamental, then we know that ultimately consciousness is an illusion that disappears at death. We know that there's nothing further. That's a clear implication of that theory. So the only way, if we want a scientific theory in which consciousness can persist beyond death, we really have to do what the physicists are saying and recognize that space-time is doomed and come up with something beyond space-time, but a scientific theory that then makes sense of these data.
I think I would just like, I don't know if Megan or Tony wanted to say anything. I was going to say something quickly. I think one of the things that I found fascinating, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've been dealing with resuscitating the brain for a couple of decades, and I find it fascinating. And but I work in the intensive care unit, and so where I specialize is dealing with people who've had oxygen deprivation to the brain and who've basically died, and we're trying to revive them and to save their brains. But one of the things that I found fascinating when I understood this and looked in the literature more was that, you know, when we're training as doctors, as scientists, there's an assumption that we all have to accept, in a sense, that the brain somehow produces the mind or consciousness. In other words, we are all conscious beings, all 6 of us who are talking right now and the others who are in the audience, we're all communicating through consciousness. And what I find astonishing is that, you know, sometimes I think we as scientists, doctors, need to have a little bit more humility, because there is so much that we don't know. In other words, if you took all the knowledge that currently exists in our world in the year 2022, and putting all the experts together, it probably comes up to a tiny pinhead compared to the knowledge that we're going to gain in 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years. And yet, you know, each one of us who's a tiny portion of that pinhead sort of seems to think they know it all. And so when we don't know something, we end up oversimplifying things to make it fit into our models. And so I find it somewhat of a travesty, actually, where some scientists, leading scientists, you know, will sort of denigrate consciousness to something as simple as, oh, it's just an epiphenomena. It's just like heat coming off a fire. It just somehow is produced from electricity in the brain and it just comes to be. Because when you look at human consciousness, it is so vast. It is so incredible. Look at all our, as Lindsey was alluding to, just our emotional states, our intellectual states. We all have, unfortunately, a little demon inside of us. We also have a little angel inside of us, and we're grappling with that every day. We have a conscience. We have so many faculties and portions to our consciousness that is shared, by the way. You know, it doesn't matter where you come from. We're all the same. We're cut from the same cloth. And yet we sort of make it, sort of dumb it down into this sort of like a phenomena that just seems to happen and that has no real meaning. And I don't think anyone really believes that, even if they say they do, because if you did believe that, then there would be no room for free will. There would be no room to blame anybody for anything they do wrong. Yet all of us, if your neighbor does something to you, you're going to get mad at them. You know, right now in the news, we're blaming people or politicians for events that are happening in the world. But if you truly believed that their brain is just producing electricity and it's just an epiphenomena, then how can you blame anyone for what they do? There would be no judiciary left if we truly believe that. So I think part one of the humility is just recognizing that consciousness is such an incredible part of what we are. And then the other part that I find fascinating is that, you know, there is, obviously we know consciousness works with the brain, and I would love to hear Lindsey's views and Tony's and others who are, you know, psychology and neurologists. But the reality is, you know, there has never been any evidence to show how brain cells could possibly generate a thought. But we're all thinking conscious beings. Everything we do is done through our thoughts. We judge each other based upon our thoughts, which lead to our actions, you know. And brain cells, like any other cell in the body, they produce proteins. It's not that complicated, actually. And now I know 100 years ago, people would say, well, we don't understand how the brain works and all this. But today you have these incredible MRI devices. You can get down to, you know, millimeter levels of structures within the brain. You have scientists who can use electrodes to look at how single brain cells work, and as well as millions of cells together. We can build artificial, mini brains, brain organoids in the laboratory. And there is no consciousness there. That's the problem. There is no generation of thoughts. And if I said to somebody, hey, let's look at this brain cell down the microscope, look, it's feeling like, oh, I'm hungry now, or it feels guilty that, it didn't speak right to somebody else. You'd say it's crazy, it's a cell. And so if you put thousands or millions of these things together and connect them to electricity, why would they suddenly generate thought? Yet we are thinking conscious beings. And I think that's the first part that I think is important, on this brain awareness, is to sort of be aware perhaps of our lack of knowledge and not oversimplifying things. And then what's really astonishing is now you look at the death part, where all our brain processes shut down. We have a ton of data what happens to brain. You stop oxygen flow, the brain stops functioning. And yet in that state of seeming unconsciousness, people who are going through death are having this lucid expansion of their consciousness, this vastness. And then they have access to aspects of their own reality that they would otherwise not have, like all their memories, everything they've done in their life, as if it's been recorded, and they're reevaluating it. And so, I'd love to hear Lindsey's views, for example, about that. Like, how do you explain that? And I think we can't, and we just have to put our hands up and say, this is something phenomenal that's happening.
I think it's such good points, and I think it's very. I think the reason this discussion is so complicated is because we're sort of trying to hold two simultaneously sort of conflicting ideas at once, and so it's like I have all of our, certainly as physicians, our training is that the brain produces these electrical experiences and or sort of electrical kind of output that creates experience, and that's it. But I think to John's point, there is sort of perhaps this other way of thinking of it, where it's not that the brain and these nuclei are producing experience, but that they're sort of somehow capturing some stuff that is out there already and giving it a way of sort of manifesting. And so I think an analogy might be the way sort of you turn on a radio and music comes out, and then you turn it off and there's not music anymore. But does that mean that the information that produced that is not here? The radio waves are there. It's just you didn't have, when the radio's off, you don't have a way of showing that they exist. And so I think my neurology mentors probably would say this is insane and not sort of scientifically based, but I think that there's definitely ways of thinking about this that we are still, I think we're still learning a lot, and there's much more than we know right now in the medical science world.
I'll jump in and echo both, or dovetail with both Sam and Lindsey said regarding consciousness. And Lindsey, I like your earlier reference to the ego death. Regarding consciousness, I think we know through psychedelic research for decades, but also through meditation, through a host of experiences we have as humans, that this one waking consciousness is but one of the ranges of experience. Psychedelic research, by the way, and to quickly frame that, the experiences they generate have been occurring since the dawn of civilization. Most people feel that they form the mystical core of the great religions. A recent Pew study showed around 49% of Americans experience a peak or mystical experience in some way, brief, not these long, hour-long ones we see with the psychedelic compounds. But clearly we're wired for meaning making, for transcendent experiences, which has been the most poignant part of this research. In addition to the dramatic reduction in suffering for these people who are dying, but in other trials as well, it's this confirmation that consciousness is way more complex than we can imagine. And I wanted to just comment on Lindsey's reference earlier. We do see in many patients, many participants in these trials, this kind of death rebirth process, which is fascinating. And again, that kind of exists in an archetypal way throughout history, this death rebirth process. There's a great quote in Greece. I've been to Mount Athos, which is a lovely peninsula off the coast of Greece, where some of the oldest Orthodox monasteries are. And over one of the monasteries, it says, if you die before you die, then you won't die when you die. It's about 1,000-year-old monastery in Greek. And I'm sure many people look at that and think, what the hell does that mean? We know what that means because we see that in our trials as well. People will experience kind of a death of self, then this rebirth into a new experience. And probably that's what meant by the word phrase born again. And in many ways that has mitigated their suffering. Some people experience consciousness as continuing after death, or they think it will, they don't know yet. Others say, no, it's lights out, I'll die when I die. But there's an immense amount of gratitude they feel for having been alive once. But it's quite remarkable. So I think the one thing it shows us that non-ordinary states of awareness, and there are many of them, have a lot to teach us about what is consciousness. And I've been struck by the overlap of near-death or recalled experiences of death in people who've had cardiac death, and these narratives we see in the near-death experience research. And I guess it begs the question, or are these experiences, do these spaces in consciousness have some kind of common ground? Is the psychedelic experience beyond time and space, as we say? Does that share some common ground with the actual NDE? And of course, unanswerable right now, but so compelling and so incredible to see people come back from the experience with such a sense of gratitude for being here, a rekindled sense of finding meaning. You know, Viktor Frankl, the great Holocaust survivor, who wrote the great book Man's Search for Meaning, wrote about, you know, meaning being the main reason how we cope with suffering. That suffering with meaning is very different from suffering without meaning. And people who are dying, when they have these meaning-making transcendent experiences, you know, it's shown in these scientific trials, and it's sustained for 4.5 years in some of the follow-ups we've done, that their emotional distress was profoundly reduced for the ones who survived. Many people have passed away before the 5-year marker. Anyway, I'll stop there for now.
I would point out that 99% of my colleagues in cognitive neuroscience who are studying consciousness are physicalists. They assume that brain activity causes whatever consciousness might be. And so with those commitments, there is absolutely no way that they can take near-death experiences as anything but brain malfunction. That framework does not allow anything further. And many of them are very happy to bite the bullet and say there is no free will, to Sam's point. Sam Harris, for example, he's got a book on free will, and he just bites the bullet and says there is no such thing, and our laws need to reflect it. Our treatment of prisoners needs to reflect that. We need to rehabilitate as opposed to incarcerate, and so forth. And there are others like Dan Dennett who say there is free will, but it's not the kind of free will that Sam wants. It's a kind of free will that says the brain is making me do it, so I do have free will. The brain did it, and it's my brain, so I chose it, and so that's my free will. And you know, Sam Harris will contradict that in a sense and say, well, I'm also growing my nails, but I don't think that you know, that's something I chose to do, so I wouldn't want to call it a free will for growing my nails. But I think my bigger point is that the framework in which you're doing your science is really critical here. And 99% of my colleagues in cognitive neuroscience have a physicalist, reductionist framework, and as long as they buy that framework, there is absolutely nothing that we can say here that will convince them to let go of that framework. So the only convincing is going to be if we can use the physicalist frameworks themselves. In other words, physics and evolution by natural selection, to show that framework itself has to come to an end. And both, as it turns out, evolution by natural selection agrees with physics, especially gravity, quantum theory and relativity put together, that space-time is not fundamental, and therefore reductionism is not a fundamentally good methodology ultimately. And until the scientific community really understands what just a few physicists understand and almost no neuroscientists understand, which is that space-time has had a good run, reductionism has had a good run, and it's over. New framework is needed. Now, the reason why it's going to be really hard for neuroscientists to do this is because neuroscience becomes suddenly much more difficult. Right now, I look through a microscope and I see a neuron. That's because there is a neuron. That I'm seeing the truth. I do EEG. That's because that's what's there. I mean, there are signals. Now with this new framework, we have to say what's beyond space-time, How does that project into space-time and give us what we call neurons? So there's this deeper reality that's much more complicated than neurons. We thought 100 billion neurons and trillions of synapses were bad. This is even far worse. The brain is just a projection of something far deeper and far more complicated. So that's the bad news. The good news is this means endless job security for neuroscientists. It's going to be, I mean, the work that when we just measure, neural activity, we're going to have to reverse engineer that and ask what it means in this deeper reality. And so there's going to be lots of work to be done in neuroscience on this. But you can see why it's going to, a few near-death experiences are not going to do it. That's not going to change. I mean, for someone like me who's open to a reality beyond space and time, the near-death experiences are wonderful data, and they're shaping my thoughts about what models of consciousness beyond space-time we should be working on. But for someone who's committed to physicalism, it's a non-starter completely. So what we have to address first are, the fact that our best physics and our best understanding of evolution by natural selection says it's over for space-time and it's over for reductionism. We need a deeper theory. And then we can start to take the NDEs as real data for a possible reality beyond space-time. It's a tall order.
I just want to pose a question. Do you consider consciousness and the self and our internal experiences, how we feel and perceive things, for example, how each of us may feel love or we feel a burst of creativity? We all have different ideas. We all have our own idea of who we are as a person. Is that the same thing as consciousness? And to go even beyond that, is there a scientifically viable way to explain all of our own subjective realities and internal experiences? If anyone has any thoughts on that.
I do, but I've talked so much. I would rather let Megan or someone talk about it. Or
I'm happy to say something. I think it's very tempting to create a neat package in which consciousness, mind, subjectivity, self, brain all get knit together, and and then because you then have determined that the kind of seat of all of this is the physical brain, you put all your attention on that, and by studying it, you're going to determine all the rest of those things. And I think historically we have moved in the direction, from, let's just make a very broad sweep of time from antiquity forward. We've moved away from talking about the soul, from talking about the spirit. Our vocabulary has changed and our concepts have changed, and so our fields of study have changed as well. I, as a philosopher, don't think it's particularly helpful to have this kind of like Mr. Potato Head version of consciousness where we just stick everything into it that we might like to stick into it and just say that's, it's just all that stuff. In part because, well, there are a lot of reasons, but, I think that the kind of like 17th century Cartesian rationalist focus on mind and the primacy of mind, and thinking about consciousness and self-consciousness, particularly in terms of mind, that's had a lot of pernicious ongoing effects. I won't go into the litany of what they are here and now, but they are vast. And so, yeah, how do we make room for complexity? How do we make room for nuance and idiosyncrasy and ambiguity? So, I think as a starting point,
maybe it's not helpful to think consciousness as a term that we just are using with any degree of coherent understanding, even in this group where we're talking together. Maybe we really have to be thinking in a finer grain kind of sensibility for what kind of consciousness, under what kinds of conditions, for whom and when and where. And that may help to sort of strip away some of the privileging of like the normal versus the quote pathological, and the divisions that we are always trying to make in order to make things more manageable, make things more repeatable, more discernible. Because consciousness I don't know, I go back to somebody like Franz Rosenzweig's Understanding the Sick and the Healthy, or, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. The world of the healthy, the consciousness of the healthy person is categorically different from the world and the consciousness of the unhealthy person. Or, Aristotle, the world of the person who has a friend is categorically different from the person who experiences their life as without a friend. So, what is consciousness across these cases? And is that, maybe we need better language. We need better attention to particularity.
I think to pick up on that, and sort of this idea of, there's not a single self, a single consciousness. There's sort of an infinite number of ways to be conscious and selves. And it's sort of, I think from the sort of medical kind of neurology perspective, as humans, we, our brains like to tell stories, and we sort of create these narratives and explanations for why we do things and why things happen to us. And, we sort of develop rules that are meant to predict how things are going to go, and these things. And I think that, in reality, we are creating our sense of self all the time. And the self that I was when I was 5 is different than from who I am now. I think something that's so amazing about particularly psychedelic research is, and this I'll put my psychiatrist hat on for a second, but, the way that people are helped with really long-standing kind of problems with depression, anxiety, sort of like long-standing ways of thinking that really are sort of people, feel that this is just who I am. I'm an anxious person. This is just how I live my life. And you have a psychedelic experience potentially, and you sort of see a different way of being, and, kind of become aware of, this is actually not all you are. You can be more than this. You can be a, different type of self. I'll let Tony speak more to that, I think.
Thank you, Lindsey. Now, one of the wonderful things about the research is that, and again, people often ask how do these medicines work, and we don't really know. We know there's some limited knowledge on the biological mechanisms. I personally think that's less important. I would not like to see psychedelics be reduced to kind of a biological reductionism, although it matters how they work. We want to learn how the brain works. But what's remarkable is that transcendent experience. And again, that seems to be, our essence in many ways. For a few hours, these medicines alter consciousness, seem to expand it in the sense that it gives us access to a broader landscape of whatever it is that is consciousness. And what I find, among many things, remarkable about the experiences in healthy people and in palliative care, there are trials with depressed, anxious people, normal, healthy people, meditators. There's been a lot of trials over the past number of years, is that it's not atypical for the experience of consciousness when altered like this to draw people into these existentially oriented questions, and including death. And why is that? I mean, it's some people speak about it as almost like a self-healing mechanism, and it sounds a bit magical woo-woo, but it does, we see that in the scientific findings, it does open people up to this broader landscape of consciousness that Aldous Huxley spoke beautifully about half a century ago. And when allowed to go with the changes, we help them before the session. Their preparation is helping them with these very important recommendations to move into the unfolding changes in consciousness and go where it's going, just be curious and go into the unfolding changes. And it's not uncommon for it to go into these themes around existential issues. Why are we here? What is death? What is life? This incredible sense of love that permeates most of the experiences that the great mystics and even Huxley spoke about. And that's what's striking, that if on its own, left to its own devices, when we access that state, consciousness seems to bring us through these experiences around death. And why would that be? And I don't have the answer for that. It's way above my pay grade, but it seems we're wired for these meaning-making experiences. And that's really interesting. And I think that's the open-ended question that these medicines and a host of activities generate. Meditation, prayer, the great mystics, poets, what is consciousness? And, it does seem to be the final frontier of science. And yeah, I'll pass it on.
From a neuroscience point of view, a neuroscientist, especially a reductionist one, would say that when we take these psychedelics that sort of depress the ego and lead to a more transcendent experience, what all we're really doing is sort of depressing the activity of the default mode network of the brain, and so that sort of explains. They would say that explains the whole thing. I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just saying that from within that framework, you would say it's the default mode network, and everything can be explained by depressing its activity. Spiritual traditions often make a distinction between consciousness, or as pure awareness, versus the self, right? That the self itself, or the ego, is a mind structure that is in some sense consciousness asleep. It's not self-aware, and it gets trapped in a little story that it's telling, and so we have to, part of meditation and so forth is to wake up from that story and recognize that we're an awareness that transcends any little story about me and how important I am and what I've done, and fear of my own death and things like that. So that we're something far more than that story, and waking up is letting go of that story. But that whole account, of course, makes no sense at all within a physicalist reductionist framework. It's, or what's often called naturalism. So from the point of view of naturalism of that kind, that story is a complete non-starter. And so to really have these ideas taken very seriously, we have to have a starter that's rigorous, but in which physicalism, space-time reductionism is not the foundation. We have something deeper and more rigorous to offer there.
I think if I could add something actually to the discussion, since we're on a roll about the self, is that, and I'd love to hear Megan's views about this, but because of what I do, I've had to end up reading and studying a lot of different components. And of course, one of the questions that always comes up when you're studying what happens when we die is, well, does something continue, when you die? Does myself continue, and so on? And I always found it very interesting when I started looking into the literature, because, as my medical training, I was just told, and I assumed that, this is what scientists believe, that everything is produced from the brain, and even if we can't explain it, that somehow it's all going to be explicable. Of course, the experiences and the lucidity of consciousness when the brain processes are down challenges that view, because it doesn't fit. It shouldn't be happening, but it's happening all the time. And in fact, we actually commissioned a poll that was carried out by Opinion Research Business across 8 different countries, and we found that roughly 10% of the population have one of these experiences. And by the way, to Donald and others, we've just recently published guidelines, and we are calling these recalled experiences of death, or recalled experiences surrounding death. But nonetheless, these are quite common. These are not simple anecdotes that 1 or 2 people report. And if you take 10%, then you're looking at a population of roughly 8 billion people. You're looking at about 800 million people are living with these experiences. So who are we to sort of dismiss them and just say these are like, nonsense or abnormal brain firing and so on? It's almost, it's somewhat unacceptable actually for people to do that. But I think going back to the question of the self, what I found amazing was that, the early Greek philosophers, were all dealing with understanding who we are. And in the same way we're having this discussion now, thousands of years ago in Athens, people were having the same discussion. And from what I understand, and correct me please if I'm wrong, Megan, is that, in those days they called us, they described this self as the psyche. And it was sort of the seat of your consciousness. It was your psychological functions. It was your memories, your emotional states, your intelligence, everything that makes us unique as human beings. And they refer to it as the psyche. And then later on, that word was translated into English in the sort of Middle Ages, I believe, to the word soul. But essentially, the psyche refers to the self. And then we got used to the word soul. And it took on a religious connotation, but it really means the self. And during the Greek times, they were debating. There were some philosophers who believed that the soul or psyche or self is produced by bodily processes, and therefore when you die, it dies with it. And there were others like Plato who believed that it's separate and that when you die, it continues. And that's why, his version of the psyche was sort of more amenable to, say, Christianity at the time. And so the idea of the soul as being separate and sort of gathered, but it really means the self. And nowadays, I just want to point out that we're referring to the same thing. We just call it consciousness. And essentially, we're talking about the self, what makes us who we are and how we come to be and how does it relate to the brain. And I think it's important for people out there to realize that we're having the same debates that Aristotle and Plato and Democritus and others had. We use more fancy terms, perhaps, but underlying it all, there is still a lack of evidence to show how the self comes to be. And to the point that's been raised by some others who are not here today, like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, if you look at it, there are many problems with the idea that your self is produced or your consciousness is produced from the brain. One of them, which I think we need to address, is, your brain is comprised of billions of cells. How is it that these activities of billions of individual cells lead to the unified sense of self that we have of me being Sam or Megan or Lindsay? It's inexplicable, but somehow it happens. So it's really incredible when you think about the things that are going on. Or another point that they raise is, well, if we're looking at consciousness, there are many organisms actually that don't have any neurons. You mentioned amoeba, I think Don mentioned amoeba, but there are many other organisms that just don't have neurons, but yet we probably think they're conscious. So how does that come to be? And so I think understanding the data and how the model doesn't fit, just because we built a model, if the real life data doesn't fit with it, I think Don said that some people just want to say, well, there's no free will. I mean, that's nonsense. If you go slap that person in the face, they're not going to be very happy with you. No matter how much they say they don't believe in free will, in real life, they do. They'll sue somebody or they'll do something about it. So, the data that we observe in our lives doesn't fit with it. And what I finally want to say is what's really remarkable is the people who die and who are brought back, people who have cardiac arrest. Universally, all of them say that the sense of self, maintains even though their brain processes have shut down. And I was watching doctors trying to revive me. I felt fine. I didn't know why they were so worried about me. In other words, none of them ever says that when I was lying there, I saw my consciousness go to the ceiling. I was like, oh, that's interesting. What's it doing up there? The sense of self is that same consciousness. And they describe it as being different to their body. And I think it's important as scientists that we don't discard 800 million people, roughly, people's testimonies. And we know throughout history where doctors have dismissed other people, and Lindsey, others tell me, when we used to dismiss, people as being hysterical or things like that, there's nonsense, go home, there's nothing wrong with you, it's all in your mind, dear. And it just goes back to the issue of the importance of having humility and understand. And I think that nobody would deny the importance to study the self and who we are. But interestingly, if you call it soul, then a lot of people reject it because they think it's something to do with religion. No, you're just talking about consciousness. You can label it whatever you want. The substance is the same. And that's the point of our discussion tonight. So I'd like to open that up. And I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that, but I find that fascinating.
I'm going to add another Greek thing. Thanks for the Plato introduction. I'm a proud Greek American, but Sam, I love the idea of, for thousands of years, people arguing, debating, using different language to describe something, when in essence, it may be consciousness. And all those frameworks are gorgeous. Each one is gorgeous if it connects us to that. Every religious lineage has this incredible framework to connect us to, ideally, the ineffable, whatever that is, consciousness. Quick on the Greeks. There's something called the Illusionian Mysteries, many of you may know about, in Eleusis, Greece, that took place about 8 miles outside of Athens from 1600 BC to about 400 AD, about 2,000 years, where they, one of the great mystery schools, that's what they were practicing, and they drank a liquid called gikion. It's a Greek word, and there's scholarly evidence that that was indeed an ergot alkaloid substance similar to a psychedelic. And Plato himself and others participated in these Illusionian Mysteries. There's a large body of literature online about it, and it was quite remarkable. But the essence of the entire mystery school was to move into death and find your immortality. And that's really interesting. And this is pre-Christian. This kind of, finding the essence of immortality through this medicine, although they were secret, and many didn't talk about it publicly. But it's an interesting piece of ancient Greek history. Speaking of the Greeks.
And I'll mention one other theory that's among cognitive neuroscientists today about consciousness in the physical world is Pan-Psychism. So integrated information theory of Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch, for example, says that fundamental particles like electrons, of course, are physical things that exist, they're fundamental, but in addition, they have a unit of consciousness. So that's, just like we had to add, in Newton, objects had position, momentum, and those are the main properties. But when we got to quantum mechanics, we had these other properties that were beyond position, momentum. We had to add spin, for example. And so we just had to say they have spin. And so we can do the same thing. We can say, well, we also need to add consciousness. So we add a unit of consciousness to electron and also to a proton. And then when they combine to form hydrogen, somehow hydrogen consciousness is a combination of the electron and proton consciousness. And so there's attempts like integrated information theory to make that kind of thing precise. But it's again going to lead to the conclusion that when the brain dissolves, the higher level consciousness that I take to be me is gone, right? So that consciousness only existed because the right pattern of connection between all the electrons and protons into neurons and neurons into networks and networks into me, that whole pattern was there. So once that dissolves, we'll still have the consciousness of electrons and protons, but we won't have myself consciousness at all. So that's one kind of framework that's being developed right now. I should say that framework is quite popular, but it has yet to be able to account for any single specific conscious experience. So if you ask them for the integrated information that is necessary and sufficient for, say, the taste of chocolate or the smell of vanilla or whatever it might be, can you just please give me one? So I know that what the integrated information system is, that is that conscious experience, and they can't give a single one. So it's the best theory we have right now, but it's a theory that cannot explain any one single conscious experience. So we're sort of at an elementary place here in those kind of physicalist, panpsychist attempts at understanding consciousness.
This is, oh, sorry, Natalia, did you want to move it forward?
No, go ahead.
I'm still like kind of caught up in all of the different things that we've raised so far, but one of them that we haven't talked much about yet is memory and consciousness. And in this last discussion, I was just thinking about Henri Bergson, who I teach and whose work I really love, but he has a really, he was very concerned about the scientism of his time and the effects of evolutionary theory and the way that it was rapidly overtaking every realm of thought, and was really worried about free will. I mean, that's like one of his major concerns. But in his theory of consciousness, he talks about organisms of increasing complexity having just enough complexity that there is room for lag between stimulus and response. And that as soon as you have an organism that has that space, let's call it, I mean, you're going to correct me, all of you, immediately, but let's call it neural space of lag, then he thinks we have consciousness. And together with that is this unpredictability of what's going to happen. So stimulus no longer produces immediate response, but there's, even like the most minimal marginal degree of hesitation is now for Bergson the mark of consciousness. So I've always thought that's really interesting. And of course, in Bergson, that's also the space of memory. So the fact that an organism is not dictated by stimulus response only, but has this sort of circuitous possibility becomes the inscription of memory and also dream and imagination. And certainly in Bergson's work, this is definitive of what he thinks of as the spiritual components of that organism.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point about memory, and it's interesting because as a neuropsychiatrist, so I treat a lot of people who have had brain injuries and who have, some of whom have been resuscitated from cardiac death, some of whom have had traumatic brain injuries, some people who have dementia and who have lost memory. It's fascinating to hear the philosophy sort of angle on it, because I think that, something I think a lot about when I see people with these problems is how much memory sort of, can or may not dictate sort of our kind of behavior moving forward. And I think that, in some cases, we sort of use memory. Well, in many cases, we sort of use our memory to create a biography and sort of a narrative timeline. And we just sort of decide, it helps us to construct who we are. But in a lot of the people I see, memory can become a prison where it's sort of, you have had this thing happen to you and you remember how you were before and you have an idea of how you should be. And you cannot come up with a new way to be a self in the world with this brain, with this experience. And the people who I treat who do the best really are sort of either able to be flexible and sort of generating a new concept of self that sort of incorporates the new experiences, or honestly, people who do not have memory of the previous self and who are able to generate a new one for that reason. And so, I treat a lot of people who are not even, not able to retain memories from one day to the next. These people are conscious, they're having experiences. They say that they feel happy, they have, sort of good quality of life. We sort of think about memory as being essential to who we are, but it is not necessarily. There's this kind of larger sense of being a self that doesn't require that kind of structured identity.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just respond to that, I feel like I have two kind of experiences related to what you're describing. One is way back when I was in high school. I was a home aide to a woman with advanced Alzheimer's. And I was so struck, I was so young, but so struck by how happy she seemed. Her husband was also there and was totally tormented by her inability to remember him, to identify basic day-to-day things. But I had a non-familial relationship with her, and every day I came, she didn't know who I was, but it wasn't upsetting to me and it wasn't upsetting to her. So that was really interesting in thinking about, the weight that we attach to memory and the communal side of memory, like how memory knits you into a community, and how difficult that can be for those in the community, that we sort of look at it from that lens primarily, like that's where memory is living. But then I also had a severe concussion and was in the immediate aftermath of the concussion, had a lot of memory issues. But the most acute, terrifying one was I could not recall the names of my kids. And it's like I knew them, but I couldn't, it wasn't like I don't know, it was a very distinctive kind of feeling where it wasn't that, it was just a blank space. It wasn't like I was trying to remember something that was there. It was just a blank. And that was so terrifying to me because that really felt connected to my sense of self. So without that memory, the question of like, who am I? How can I possibly live this way? So those are kind of two different sides of that issue that I've thought a lot about.
Right. There's some other interesting neurological properties of memory that might bear on this in consciousness. One is anesthetic nausea. So some people with the right parietal stroke can have left hemiplegia and be in denial that there's any problem. Their left side of their body is paralyzed, and they deny that there's any problem at all. And they discovered that you could cure them temporarily by putting, I think, cold water in the left ear or warm water in the right ear. And for about 8 hours, the patient comes out of that denial, and they say that they've, they're complaining now about their paralyzed left arm and left leg. And one neurologist asked the woman who'd been there with this, how long have you had this problem? She said, oh, doctor, the whole 2 weeks I've been here. So she'd been denying it for 2 weeks. This little intervention, all of a sudden now she's aware, but then 8 hours later, she goes back into denial. She's forgotten that she had remembered that she was paralyzed, and she's back into, and when you say, well, just 2 hours ago, you were saying that you were paralyzed, and then she'll confabulate some story about why she had said that. And so that's, memory and self are, very, very interesting. And it gets even deeper in the case of split brain patients, where you can, cut the corpus callosum, which is the band of fibers between the left and right hemisphere, about 220 million fibers. And when you do that to help with certain problems with epilepsy and so forth, you don't do this just for fun, you do it for treatment. And you find that the left and right hemispheres actually have different memories and different personalities and different religious beliefs. V.S. Ramachandran found the left hemisphere in one person believed in God, and the right hemisphere was an atheist. And the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere, and it would fight the right hand that's being controlled by the left hemisphere when they disagreed about what wardrobe choices that you want to make or what food you're going to be making. But what you could tell things to the right hemisphere that the left wouldn't know. So that you would have memory only in one, so that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere could play 20 questions. You could give a word to the right hemisphere, and then the left hemisphere would take 20 questions to try to guess what the right hemisphere knew. So in the same head, there's a memory that one person has with one personality that doesn't believe in God, and the person that does believe in God doesn't know what it is and is trying to figure it out through 20 questions. So within one skull, you can have this really interesting, complex combination of beliefs and memories and different selves, which we'll also have to understand neurologically.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. This conversation has been amazing. And we are running out of time a little bit. I do want to save some time just for a Q&A session for the audience that's here. Something that I just kind of wanted to circle back to that we brought up at the beginning of the conversation was these experiences that were happening at the end of life. And we briefly touched on the recalled experiences of death that people have, and how Dr. Bossis, you spoke about how there are many similarities between the what we're going to call REDs and the psychedelic experiences that your patients are having. And unfortunately, we weren't able to actually get a cardiac arrest survivor who had an RED to the panel today. But I did want to read a quote of that we have from them from an interview that we did, just because there is a very unique quality to these recalled experiences of death. And Dr. Parney, I believe that you did mention this in the beginning, but it is this review of their lives, and not only the actual situations that happen, but also all of the different thoughts and feelings and the impacts that their intentions and actions had on others. So I'm gonna just read this quote if you bear with me, and then we can kind of take it from there. So this person said, I saw a movie which was my life from birth to death, every minute of it, every event I had ever experienced. It was at this point I realized time no longer appeared to me as it had in my body. While watching and re-experiencing each moment, I found I was now able to experience each event through all of the emotions present at each time. I watched my own poor mistakes and learned from reliving how big an impact my seemingly small actions had on a larger scale, how my choices and behavior rippled through the lives of others, how the love I showed spread like wildfire, how the way I mistreated others deeply hurt and affected them, and how the pain, fear, and confusion would then impact the lives of others as well. In the quote time I spent in this reliving, I developed a deep gratitude for many things. And so one of the things that a lot of these cardiac arrest survivors who have REDs will say is that this experience they have is probably one of the most realistic, lucid events that they've had even in life. And I guess I kind of wanted to end on how, well, I'm just a bit curious, I guess, about how these ideas would apply to your own lives, your own day-to-day lives, and how you go about everything, and what is the impacts that, or the implications this knowledge may have on how we treat others.
Can I just add a quick point to that? And
Yes.
thank you for bringing that up, Natalia, because it's incredibly touching when you listen to what these people have to say. It's easy to dismiss when you haven't listened to the testimonies. When you go through, as we've done, hundreds and thousands of these testimonies, it is incredibly powerful. And one of the things that I can maybe just point out here, which I find incredible, is that when you do listen to them, it really does have a very poignant effect on ourselves. I mean, for me personally, one of the things I'm beginning to recognize more and more is, I work in an intensive care unit. I deal with life and death every day. And somehow we seem to block out the idea that our life is finite in our own lives. We're so busy with the stuff, the noise of life, that we kind of lose the signal, which is that actually we're not going to be around forever. And all those things. And when you look back, a lot of those things that you were putting all your mental energy and effort on become so meaningless, actually. All the quarrels and things like that. And what's incredible is that at death, what becomes clear to these people, and I'm sure the same thing will happen to us, is that what did matter was how we worked actively to cultivate our humanity. And I think that's incredible because we teach that to our children, but somehow in our own daily lives, we seem to forget about it. And it's humbling to hear these people say that. And for myself, what this has done is made me very conscious about these things in life. And also recognizing that I'm not going to be around. I might be around for a couple more years. I mean, we had COVID. None of us knew if we'd be around for another month, actually, when we were working in the ICU. I thankfully managed to come out of that. Some of my colleagues didn't come out of it. And who knows what's going to come tomorrow? Tomorrow is promised to nobody. And it would be a shame to look back on life and feel that you've wasted it. And I feel that that's what these people tell us. They say that, we recognize that if we hadn't concentrated on this, that's sort of a wasted life. And that goes back to a lot of what philosophers have talked about throughout history, right? So what is the purpose of life and what are we here for?
It's beautiful, Sam. And thank you, Natalia, for reading that as well. Yeah, just personally. So, and by the way, a shout out to an article that Sam was lead author on recently, and there's a wonderful table with many quotes like that, and they're very impactful. When I read them, I get very moved. They're very emotional, even though they have these recurrent themes. Each one is very poignant, and in the research we're doing, it's very similar. People are asked to write their experiences down after the day in this peak or mystical or numinous state, transcendent state, and they're very similar. And it's like the golden rule almost, right? I mean, the of all religions, treat others like you want to be treated yourself. And I've been struck by and Sam's in the article, there's a quote of this as well, that in the life review, people often experience every thought, action, and deed from the perspective of the other. Every judgment we make, every time we fall short with someone, or we experience the effect it had. And you think if every morning we woke up with that experience, we would all live pretty differently than we all are now on this planet. And personally, to bear witness to these experiences in these rooms, so these are all day experiences, 8 hours. A person's lying on a couch in the hospital setting, a very lovely, elegant kind of living room-like setting within the medical center. And it's to bear witness, to sit there and bear witness as they go through those changes. And we do very little. There's very little talking. If it goes well, we're just there to reassure them and check in on them and monitor their safety. And it changes you. It has changed me over the years to leave at the end of the day and hearing these incredible stories. And hopefully they're reminders each day to, live differently, which we all forget. It's the incredible part of humanity that we know these truths to be true. And at the end of life, they come back in a very strong way, or with these experiences. And it's my guess that this is part of what spirituality was probably generated for, to be reminders, to connect to that, whatever that ineffable experience is. And when we do so, it seems we live better. So all a bit poignant given the time, given what's happening today in our world. So yes, and thank you for having me here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to all of you for joining. I do want to open up to the audience. If you guys do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Not the chat that is going on, but there is a actual Q&A section that you can ask your questions. So just wait a little while. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to put them in there.
Looks like Natalia, I'm just looking, there's a couple of questions. Maybe you can just read it out and send it to ask whoever wants to answer this. First question is 658 actually. Alec Martinez. I can read it out too if you want. This is physicist Sean Carroll says that if consciousness is non-local or non-physical, we would be able to witness its effects on what we can see. But that we understand the core theory of physics enough to know that this isn't the case, that classic Newtonian physics governs structures as big as the brain. But in the past few years, we have seen much exploration and some evidence of quantum mechanics at work in large biological structures. For example, birds navigating magnetic fields, plants, and photosynthesis, and so on. What do you think about quantum biology, perhaps most appropriately applied in the Penrose-Hameroff OR theory? If Don, you want to take that, or?
Yes. Quantum biology is a wonderful, relatively new branch of science, and we are finding amazing quantum effects. Apparently, plants discovered how to use quantum mechanics, quantum effects in gathering light billions of years ago. So anytime you see a green plant, you're seeing something that's using quantum effects to optimize eating light. So quantum biology has been around for a long, long time. The Penrose-Hameroff OR theory is a theory about how consciousness might arise from so-called orchestrated collapse of certain quantum states of special electrons and microtubules in the brain. And the idea was that if you get the right orchestrated collapse of these quantum states of electrons and microtubules in the brain, then you could have specific conscious experiences. And this was derived in part because of Penrose's view that that there's something, Gödel's incompleteness theorem indicates that there's something non-computational going on in the world, perhaps about human consciousness, human understanding. And this orchestrated, the collapse of the wave function under gravity might also be non-computable. And so that the non-computability might be in some sense the same in both cases. I certainly agree with Penrose that the Gödel incompleteness theorem indicates that there's something beyond computation. There's reality beyond computation, and that's important. But the OR theory of consciousness, I know Stuart. He's a good friend of mine, and every time I'm on a panel with him on stage at a conference, I ask him the same question, and he knows I'm going to ask it. And that is great theory, Stuart. Okay, so give me one. What is a specific conscious experience and the orchestrated collapse that has to be the taste of chocolate or the smell of vanilla or a headache? Great abstract theory, but we're scientists. We would like testable hypotheses that make specific predictions. What specific conscious experience can you predict? And tell me what the OR has to be for that. And they can't give a single one. And so until then, there's nothing on the table for me as a scientist specifically. There's this general idea that maybe something like this could happen at some point. And it's the same thing with integrated information theory. There's a general idea that maybe at some point we could do this, but there's no specific prediction about a specific conscious experience that says this has to be that experience. And so until then, there's not really something satisfactory on the table for me.
Maybe I'll just add two words to this too. I think that, what's fascinating in the discussions with consciousness is that when you look at the literature, it's very different the way it's presented. And the problem I find with many things, the way the media simplify things or present things, it gives an impression as if everyone believes in the same thing, and it's not true. In other words, it's sort of presented as if scientists will believe that consciousness is produced by brain activity, and that's the end of the story, and it's an epiphenomenon, like you said. But what is fascinating, when you look at the literature, you see that there's actually a split. There are many scientists, as Don pointed out, who have proposed that basically, essentially, we don't know how brain processes generate thoughts. They accept that, hands up, we don't know. We don't know how it produces the phenomena of consciousness and everything that we experience internally. But that somehow it has to be produced by the brain. And to my point, that's no different to what Democritus used to say. Maybe he didn't specify the brain, but like this was an argument in ancient Greece as well, that somehow this has to be happening. We just don't know how. Because that's what we can see and that's what we can palpate. We can see the body, so we're like, it has to be here somewhere. But there are also others, and so within that group, people like even Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner scientist, who believe that. And it's important to appreciate it's a belief. There is no real scientific evidence for it. And then you have the other camp, and again, including Nobel Prize winners, who believe that essentially consciousness cannot be explained by brain processes, and that we have to accept that consciousness is separate. It's a separate, undiscovered scientific entity. And just because we don't have the tools today to see it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I think the analogy that Lindsey gave was great. If you look at a radio or a TV set, you can break down all the processes, all the wiring and everything that occurs in it, and you can damage it. You have a stroke, you get a damage to a part of the wiring, say in the brain or in a radio or a TV set. If you show that to a 2-year-old, they're going to think the presenter is sitting in the box. And you can test it scientifically by pulling the odd wire out and see that you lose the sound or you lose half the image. But that's only because you can see the box. You don't see the electromagnetic waves that are coming from 3,000 miles away. And so I think the complexity with consciousness is that it might well be a different entity that hasn't yet been discovered, and we just have to find better tools to show it. And once we do, we can answer that question once for all. But the thing that's important is that we have to ask the question. If we're not willing to ask the question and not accept that our paradigm that there is no data to support what that theory is, then we have to be open to at least be unbiased and be willing to explore other things. And that's what's interesting. And I think when the Hameroff and Penrose theory comes in, is like people trying to shift the complex, going from neurons to say the cytoarchitecture of the cells and quantum processes, but it still doesn't answer the question of, okay, so if there's a quantum process, how does thought come to be, right? And that's what I think you're saying, Don, right? It still doesn't answer the fundamental question, how consciousness comes to be. You've just taken it one level lower down in the physical processes that you understand. So it's fascinating.
By the way, Natalia, real quick, I want to make one correction. I mentioned the paper that Sam worked on before. Just Sarah Karsev is also the key author on that, who did incredible work. I want to make sure I mention her as well.
Yeah, and since you bring it up, I think people should know, we and Tony was part of that, and many others. There was a group we got together multidisciplinary neuroscientists, psychologists from humanities, and neuro-intensive care experts, or, critical care experts, and so on, who discussed and reviewed all the literature on what happens to consciousness in relation to death, what is death itself. And that was recently published in the New York Academy of Sciences. It's the first ever guideline and consensus statement that lays the foundation for how to study this for future generations. If anyone is interested, I highly recommend that they read it, not because we happen to be part of it, but I think it is a lot of work that went into it. And you're right, one of our colleagues, Tara Shirazi, put a lot of effort. She went through all the drug-induced experiences, hallucinations, and so on, characterized them, and is able to show that these are fundamentally different to the experiences of death, even though people sometimes present them differently.
Maybe post the URL where we can download that, please.
I will try to get it as if I can multitask, I will try to do that. I'm not that good at multitasking. I'll try and do it for the audience as well. That's a good point.
So I'm going to try to get in a few more questions. I do want to ask this question because it is about a recent paper that made international headlines, and I'm sure many people on the panel and also in the audience have heard of. But it was a recent paper by a doctor in Louisville who they had a man hooked up to an EEG, and they were recording his brain waves, and it just so happened that he had died while the EEG was connected. So we were able to get all of the brain activity that occurred during death or during the death process. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the question that was asked here. It says, the data shows that the gamma waves spiked just before the man underwent cardiac arrest. Do you think that this could be due to his consciousness starting to, quote, decouple from his brain, and that the process was fully completed when the man died or just after? We can also just talk about what people's thoughts are on that paper if you have read it. I think I spoke to some of the panelists before about it, and they had some opinions. So.
Send the question to somebody in the audience. You've spoken to the panelists. You've spoken to the panelists. I'm happy to address it quickly, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, I didn't see anyone unmute themselves. But I think what's fascinating is that we're understanding in medicine, and I would love to hear Lindsey's view. We're also busy that sometimes we don't get a chance to talk, and this is an opportunity for us to talk amongst ourselves too. So, we rely on clinical tests of consciousness, and we look to see if there are people who are able to move their arms, if they're able, their eyes, if they're able to speak. This is the so-called Glasgow Coma Scale, and we use basically clinical markers of responsiveness to determine if someone is conscious or not. And what I think is becoming incredibly clear is that those tests are not adequate to determine if someone has consciousness. And consciousness being the mystery that we've been discussing tonight is obviously a different story, but even at these tests are not. And what's incredible at death is that we see the brain shuts down. But what is really remarkable is that what seems to be happening in the same way that the body is trying to save itself. And so it basically, you sort of start to send all the blood to the heart and the brain as much as you can, and you sacrifice the arms, the legs, the gut, and other parts of the body to save yourself. What seems to be happening with death is that although most of the brain becomes, inhibited and is being shut down, which is what we would expect, because maybe it's no longer relevant to keeping you alive. But what seems to then be happening is that this sort of leads to a disinhibition of parts of the brain that would otherwise not be accessible under ordinary circumstances, like how we're talking today. And it might be that at death, what we're seeing is this phenomena occurring. You're shutting down the parts that are no longer relevant, but in so doing, you're unearthing a part that had been dampened down ordinarily in life. And that's giving you access to aspects of reality, to dimensions of reality that you would otherwise not have. And for instance, that includes this entire lucid experience that's occurring with consciousness. And so, we have to think that might be an evolutionary mechanism, something that's programmed, and that's why everyone's having it. And we have to take it a little more seriously. And with respect to the paper that the question was asking, what this doctor was able to show was that you were getting this sort of surge of gamma activity, which is a very high frequency brain activity. just after death, just after the heart had stopped, which we would expect not to occur. And so it might be that that's a marker. They're proposing that might be a marker to illustrate that this is when the person is having this lucid life review that we've just talked about. It may well be. We have other evidence from our patients that supports that as well, and those papers are going to be published soon. The problem is, of course, that individual didn't live, and so we don't know if they actually had an experience. But certainly it's something to think about, because ordinarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lindsey, but or Dawn and others, that this gamma activity is seen in states of heightened consciousness. And the fact that it was observed after the heart stopped, someone gone beyond death, was remarkable in its own right.
Yeah, I think, sort of thinking about, talked about sort of a little bit, I think you referenced at the beginning, the sort of chemical changes that happen sort of immediately after death. And we know also in other types of brain injury, sort of traumatic brain injury and these kinds of things where, something happens and then you get sort of what's called this kind of excitotoxic sort of cascade, where there's a flood of these chemicals that normally live inside the neurons that then, because either the neurons are injured or because of some other mechanism that triggers this, you get sort of a flood of this excitatory, in particular a neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the nervous system. And so, we don't know kind of what is the subjective experience of having that excitotoxic surge. Like we sort of talk about it from the outside and say this is damaging and it kind of causes problems, but it may be that you're, in the moment sort of having this expanded or heightened experience that is showing up on scans as kind of increased brain activity, and that might be subjectively experienced as something kind of outside of the realm of normal daily existence.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I think I'm gonna just cut the questions there. There are some questions here about if the panel was recorded, and it was, and you'll be able to find it on YouTube. See a few questions there about where they'll be able to watch it. So just once again, I wanted just to thank everyone who joined us tonight. And if you have any last thoughts, go ahead. But if not, thank you again. And hopefully we'll be able to organize something along these lines again in the future.
I just add one quick point that we said we would do, and I'm not able to. I couldn't get the URL for the guidelines. So if anyone's interested, I think if you just search under my name, perhaps, and guideline, then it should come up on Google. And then I also noticed, Natalia, that a number of people who are cardiac arrest survivors, and I guess we'd love to hear from you. We are doing a study in our laboratory where we're studying cardiac arrest survivors' experiences. If you go to our website at NYU, again, my laboratory, then there is a link that you can go in and be able to interview you and go through your experiences, which we would very much like to do. And I think that's just a couple of quick things that I noticed. And I would like to also personally thank our host, our moderator, Natalia Leontovich, who I think you've done a great job, opened up such incredible debates and discussions amongst us. And I think what this tells me is that I think we needed more time. We need another hour, it sounds like. So maybe we have to do this again in the futures.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm going to end with a quick 2-sentence quote that Sam triggered in my mind. He mentioned Nobel Prize winners, and I have a 2-sentence quote that I often show. So Sir John Eckley is a Nobel neurophysiologist. In his book, Evolution of the Brain, Creation of the Self, 1989, he writes, "I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim that materialism can account for all the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world." Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And
Great
thank you
pleasure.
to our audience. And we wish this was live and we could have seen you and seen your questions. And hopefully now that we're coming out of COVID, we can have another one and we'll all be together and the audience will be live.
Just wanted to add one quick note. I did put a link to the consensus and guidelines statement into the chat, which I believe everyone has access to.
And we have an Instagram page, don't we? And that we'll be able to post this on the Instagram, right? I hope. And and maybe we can post a link to the guideline on Instagram. So
All right. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.